Aristotle once wrote a sentence that feels incomplete until you have lived long enough to be troubled by it: that a man can spend his entire life in motion and still remain exactly where he began, not because he lacked effort, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the direction of his effort was never truly his own. There is a quiet discomfort that lives beneath modern life. It does not announce itself. It does not interrupt you. It waits. You wake, you move, you decide, you act, and everything appears functional. But beneath that surface, there is something unsettled, a kind of invisible instability, not enough to alarm you, just enough to follow you. The Greeks would have noticed this immediately. They were not impressed by motion. They were suspicious of it. Because motion, without structure, is simply erosion in disguise. Walk through the ruins of the Parthenon, not as a tourist, but as an observer. You will notice something strange. The columns are broken, the roof is gone. Time has done its work. And yet, what remains still feels deliberate, still feels anchored. Now compare that to modern structures that collapse. They fall suddenly, without dignity, without resistance, as if they were never meant to stand. The Greeks understood something we have forgotten. Strength is not measured by appearance, it is measured by what a structure depends on. And this is where the discomfort begins. Because most people do not know what their financial life depends on. They believe they do. Income, opportunities, connections. But belief is not structure. I didn't question this at first. I was moving. That was enough. Money was coming in. Decisions were being made. There was activity. And activity creates the illusion of control. But slowly, something began to feel off. Not wrong, not broken. Just unstable. I would make what felt like a good decision and feel a subtle tension afterward. I would earn and still feel pressure. I would plan. And yet something beneath the plan felt uncertain. It wasn't failure. That would have been easier to identify. It was something quieter, more persistent. Let me ask you something carefully. Have you ever felt like your life is moving forward, but not settling into place? Not collapsing? Just never fully stabilizing? The Greeks had a word for the opposite of this. Arete. Not wealth, not status, not even achievement, but excellence in structure. A life built in such a way that it does not constantly need correction. And here is the problem. Arete cannot be built on something unstable. I did not know what was unstable yet, only that something was. So I did something that felt unnecessary at first. I stopped trying to improve my finances, not because I had solved them, but because I realized I might be improving the wrong thing. Instead, I began observing, not what I earned, not what I spent, but what influenced those actions. The Greeks did not begin with results, they began with causes, and causes are often hidden beneath habits that feel normal. The first few days were uneventful, nothing changed externally, but internally. There was friction, small decisions began to feel heavier. Things I used to do without thinking now required attention. I noticed how often I checked things that did not require checking, how quickly I reacted to information that did not require action, how easily I justified choices that had no clear foundation. And this is where something uncomfortable surfaced. A large part of my behavior was not deliberate, it was conditioned. Let me ask you something directly. How many of your financial decisions are made without conscious thought? Not because they are efficient, but because they have become automatic. And more importantly, who designed those patterns? Because if you did not design them, then they were built by something else. The Greeks would call this a loss of governance. A man who does not govern his actions will always be governed by something. By the fifth day, I began to feel resistance, not external resistance, internal. There were actions I wanted to take, but could not fully justify. Spending that once felt harmless, now felt exposed. Decisions that once felt normal, now felt questionable. And yet, nothing had changed externally. Only my awareness. This is where most people stop. Because awareness creates discomfort, and discomfort feels like a problem. But the Greeks did not treat discomfort as a problem. They treated it as information. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What habits in your life only survive because you have never questioned them? What patterns continue? Not because they are effective, but because they are familiar. By the seventh day, something began to separate. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to notice. The difference between what I believed I was doing and what I was actually doing. I thought I was making decisions, but many of my actions were responses. Responses to what? That question stayed with me, because once you see response, you begin to question the trigger, and the trigger is rarely what you think it is. Let me ask you something. When you spend money, what actually causes the decision? Is it need, or is it timing, emotion, environment? Because if the cause is external, then the action is not fully yours. And if the action is not fully yours, then neither is the outcome. The Greeks understood this deeply. They did not trust actions that were influenced by what they could not command. Because anything you cannot command, you cannot rely on. And anything you rely on will shape your life. This is where things became clearer, not comfortable, clear. I realized that much of my financial behavior was structured around things I did not control. Not directly, not consistently. And yet, I was reacting to them as if I did. This is where the instability was coming from, not from lack, but from dependence on unstable variables. Let me ask you something carefully. How much of your financial life is built on outcomes you do not command? Market conditions, other people's decisions, timing, trends. And if those shift, what happens to your structure? By the 10th day, I made a decision, not about money, about rules. I would operate only within what I could command, nothing more. At first it felt restrictive, like reducing my world. But what I did not expect was what it revealed. The list of what I could control was small: my actions, my discipline, my attention, my choices. That was all. Everything else was influence, not ownership. And so I began to cut, not randomly, precisely. If it was not within my control, it was removed from my decision-making, not ignored, but no longer used as a foundation. This changed everything. Not dramatically, but immediately. Decisions became simpler, not easier, simpler, because complexity had been coming from variables I could not command. Remove those, and clarity remains. Let me ask you something. If you removed everything you cannot control, how much confusion would remain in your life? By the 14th day, the shift became visible. Spending decreased, not through effort, through awareness. Decisions aligned, not through force, through structure. And something else appeared. Stability. A feeling that had been missing, without being noticed, because most people do not realize they are unstable until they experience stability. The Greeks built for this, not speed, not expansion, stability, because stability allows growth without collapse. Let me ask you something. Are you trying to grow faster? Or are you trying to build something that does not collapse? Because those are not the same path. By the 18th day, confidence appeared. Not loud, not visible, quiet. The kind that comes from alignment, from knowing that your actions are not dependent on unstable forces. This is what the Greeks meant by inner governance. A man who governs himself is not easily moved by the world, and a man who is not easily moved can build something that lasts. This is where finances begin to shift. So not through strategy, through identity. When you operate within control, you become selective. And selection is what shapes outcomes. Let me ask you something directly. Are you reacting to your financial life, or are you selecting it? Because those two paths do not lead to the same place. By the 21st day, the experiment ended, but the structure remained. Because once you experience clarity, you cannot return to confusion without noticing it. And once you feel stability, instability becomes obvious. The Greeks did not chase wealth, they built structures that could hold it. Because without structure, wealth becomes pressure, and pressure eventually breaks what cannot support it. Let me ask you one final question. If everything outside your control disappeared, what would remain of your financial life? And would that be enough to build something lasting? Because in the end, your life is not shaped by what happens to you, it is shaped by what you can command. And as Epictetus wrote, some things are within our power, while others are not.